Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here always with London Paul. And Paul, history is wrecked full of irony. And the biggest irony that has come up in the recent days is the fact that Janet Yellen, the US Treasury, is going to suspend some of the sanctions for a period of time because they desperately need Russian commodities. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion. And if it wasn't so sad, it would be funny.
Well, yeah, firstly, obviously, thanks for joining me also. As ever, it's always a pleasure when we get together. So, yeah, this is something I obviously posted on X, as it's called now. And unsurprisingly, there was a lot of interaction on it because it just highlights this ongoing debacle where the United States insists on everyone else imposing tough sanctions on Russia, probably knowing full well that by imposing those sanctions on Russia, it actually also weakens the countries that do, but they're forced to do so. Well, their allies are forced to do so. I mean, we know the global South countries just ignore the sanctions and carry on doing whatever they want to do, like obviously India and importing enormous amounts of Russian oil, ironically, which it then sells on to Europe, which is sanctioned oil, and Europe buys it but pays a whacking premium on it. It's that kind of absurdity. But this absurdity is interesting for a number of reasons because the US Treasury, for a period, well, at least till April next year, and then it can be just renewed, which it probably almost certainly will. There is an argument the war probably with Ukraine will be over by then. Maybe it won't be, but by then they'll just renew it because they have to, because the removal of the sanctions is to allow financial transactions to be conducted with multiple Russian banks. And what's this to permit? It's the purchasing of oil, which will surprise people. We'll come on to why. Petroleum, products, natural gas, that might surprise people as well. Coal, timber, uranium, and other sort of components of renewables. Now, why is this important? Because the United States desperately needs these commodities. Oil, we've talked about previously, but it's worth reiterating as a very obvious example. Russia has to, or someone has to export heavy oil to the United States because its own oil is light crude. And the problem with that is you can't utilize light crude to obviously produce diesel or jet fuel or bunker fuel, which is bunker is obviously for shipping containers. So without that capability, the United States is in serious, serious trouble. We have mentioned that previously, but what this demonstrates is the United States can't source this from anywhere else because either no one else is prepared to sell it to them, which is quite likely to be true, or no one else has got the capability to sell it to them in the quantities and what they need specifically. But the question is this going to include other removal of restrictions on other commodities in the future? But it shows, A, the vulnerability of the United States in terms of lacking those commodities, even though a lot of people think the United States has unlimited commodities itself. And well, we're the biggest oil producer in the world. Well, it's meaningless because they need heavy oil. So they either go begging to the Venezuelans who's told them to go away politely, or the Iranians forget that it's not going to happen. So they have to beg the Russians. And despite the fact that the United States threw the kitchen sink at Russia in terms of trying to sanction them into oblivion, which of course completely failed, they're still prepared to do so. I think there aren't many nations on the planet who would do that. But Russia continues to do so. But it could change its mind in the future. And the United States is mindful also of why it doesn't want to push the Russians too far, because maybe Russia will just say, well, we're not sending you these commodities anymore. You're in serious trouble. Because just worth noting, the US pays Russia roughly $1 billion a year for enriched uranium because it can't enrich uranium itself. And that is used obviously for nuclear reactors. And why is that important? Because that provides the United States with probably sort of 20 to 22% of its energy needs. That's how critical it is. So if they don't get the uranium or the enriched uranium, they're in big trouble. So if they can't pay for it, Russia will say, you're not paying for it, you're not having it. Make the payment, we'll send it. So uranium's another example of why there's a problem, but it's just the hypocrisy that's laughable. But underneath it all demonstrates the vulnerability of the United States picking on a proxy war with a country on who it depends to a far larger extent than people realize on commodities it desperately needs. Otherwise, if the United States doesn't get enriched uranium and doesn't get this heavy oil, then the ramifications will be very, very serious. And for the US, never mind the issue of timber, coal, natural gas, etc., which is included in this list.
See, what's really fascinating is you go back to, when was it, 2006, 7, 8, 9. I can't remember off the top of my head if it was before or after the GFC, but uh, the U.S. decided that they were going to vilify Venezuela. And Venezuela, as a trading partner, they had a ton of heavy crude, which is what the U.S. needs for many of its things like jet fuel, et cetera, et cetera. And as a matter of fact, Venezuela had a um, a franchise of gas stations that they were so integrated into our energy thing. And because of politics, whether it was from the White House or from any of the myriad of three-letter agencies, they went on a crusade against Hugo Chavez and then later Maduro, and they have really cut off their supply of heavy crude. And thus, who's left? Well, it requires then, having to deal with Russia. But if you're sanctioning Russia and you're vilifying them in public, it's kind of difficult to have them, expect them to want to play ball with, their adversary. You don't want to say completely enemy, but definitely their adversary. And it's kind of ironic too, because after the BRICS, we're starting to see a shift from India getting down off that fence and moving more into the China and Russia camp, much stronger than playing both sides, to their own benefit. And I think that's something the U.S. is definitely going to have to really take into consideration when they, pick on one of the partners, whether it's China, which we'll talk about maybe in another podcast, Russia, etc. The more that they impose these things, the more, and we've talked about this in the past, the more nations, especially in the global South, are going to look at the United States, not see them as a reputable and a partner with integrity, and they're just not going to want to do business with them. And from that, how long, and you've got to take into consideration what the next administration is going to do. If Kamala Harris wins, nothing's going to change because you're still going to have the same players in office doing their running roughshod and wanting to impose their ideological, will on the world. But is there going to be a change with the next one? I can't say yes or no. But from what we know of Trump in his 4 years in office, he looks to make deals and appeasements rather than to create conflicts. So that in itself could be some type of change. Now, he does have these burrs in his head. He has this thing against Iran. He has this thing against Venezuela. He would almost likely go to war with certain bugaboos that, he really sticks in his mind. But for the big players like Russia, China, etc., it's going to be more tactical, economic than it would be militarily. And from there, who knows what's going to come of it. But with that being said, it's so ironic. I think that somebody like Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, you wonder if she made the call or if somebody, you know, behind the scenes made the call on this to deal with to let loose the sanctions for a short period of time, because it does appear that the desperation of the U.S. in regards to not just commodities, but their economy as a whole is standing really on the brink, not just debt wise, but also, what's going on internally as you see a number, the economy really start to fall, the unemployment, the GDP, and, their ability to be able to impose their hegemonic will around the world is diminishing rapidly. All of these things are coming to a head all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing with the US, it can't escalate anything with Russia and China because they're nuclear powers. I mean, if they weren't nuclear powers, they would most certainly try to. But anyway, that's by the by. But what I would say is, and this is a great example of the futility and stupidity of sanctions, because there's a company in Kazakhstan called Kazatomprom, and they produce over 40% of the world's uranium. Now, because of sanctions, the traditional route to market used to be through St. Petersburg. That wasn't possible. So alternative routes seem quite prohibitively expensive. So because of this, they were then considering switching exports solely to Russia and Chinese markets. And that's a great example where there's no thought applied to these sanctions. And the consequences, therefore, would mean, well, probably as a byproduct of this idea of paying for uranium, the US is going to have to turn a blind eye. And let's be honest, for the last 2.5 years, they've turned a blind eye when it suits them to many, many sanctions. And really, what have they done to punish the Indians? Nothing. It's all just hot air sanctions, but it's the sanctions boomerang that is the biggest problem that the West is facing. We're not going to get into Germany. It's obvious the lack of cheap Russian energy is destroying their own economy and making them highly uncompetitive. But there's one example of how the sanctions were just not thought through, clearly in terms of what needed to be put in place. And also, the other thing is, if you look throughout the entire 2.5 years, I mean, just go back a couple of months ago, where Russia still exports large amounts of crude oil relatively to Hungary and Slovakia. That continues. And it's been shipped continually via Ukraine, of all places. You'd think the Ukrainians would have switched it off, but they haven't. And then I think this is very telling that one of the world's biggest, or arguably it is the world's biggest oil field services company, is actually expanding operations in Russia, even though it's other Western rivals, you might say, or alternative oil field services companies left Russia way back at the start of the war. And that company is SLB. They're Houston based. They used to be known as Schlumberger. I think people have probably heard of that, or quite a lot of people. They've
Or
signed,
Schlumberger.
yeah, who I always call it because I find the other pronunciation. Anyway, that's just me.
I've heard both. I just for the people who may think of it as
yeah. So they've signed all these new contracts, recruited hundreds of staff in Russia, and that's even after, of course, rival companies, Baker Hughes, etc., departed the Russian shores. They're not unique in doing this. Now, in no way is the United States going to sanction SLB in any way, shape, or form for doing this. But this is because they need the business. They have to have a presence there. And again, it's just not thinking through the consequences of actions that are going to impact industry and big industry in the United States. SLB is a huge company. And also another point worth making when you look at gas transit. Now, gas transit's supposed to end because they won't renew the contract at the end of this year. But if you go through in the first half of 2024, Russian gas transit through Ukrainian pipelines increased by 10.5%. year on year. It was over 8 billion cubic meters. It's nothing to be sniffed at. But again, that was, even though there's a war going on, Ukraine didn't renege on the contract. So you have to give them credit for not reneging on that contract as much as Russia honored the contract also. But of course, that's just transiting Ukraine. It goes on to other countries. Now, of course, again, if that gets switched off, then the energy crisis in Europe rears its head again. But we're not going to talk about the energy crisis specifically. But another point worth making is, and this is something, the West has made this big play. We're going to cut Russia's oil and gas revenue because we're going to starve their war machine by them having no money. Well, if you look back in parts of this year, throughout the year, their gas revenues rose month or year over year in particular months. They rose 50%. And they are expecting revenues in 2024 for oil and gas to be 21 to 25% higher than they were in 2023. Now, okay, you can argue, say, well, oil prices were high, gas prices weren't particularly. But yes, and you have to take that into consideration, but it shows equally the idea of impacting Russia's energy markets failed completely. And that's because in the end, there was a realization that when they talked about doing it, that, well, actually, we can't do without Russian oil and gas. And bear in mind, of course, this is revenue directly. There's all the revenue Russia was getting by selling huge amounts of energy to the likes of the Indians, who take what they need and then sell it on to Europe in the process. I mean, so you have to kind of add those revenues in as well, because it's indirect revenue that Russia's generating through these sales. So it's could arguably be 40, 50% high. So that's just another example of the fiasco of sanctions and why they're just sanctions in name. There's no teeth to them. There's no way of implementing them properly. And in fact, there's no way that the United States, ironically, has gone after any of the countries who have defied sanctions, and particularly not their supposed allies, because plenty of NATO countries have been defying sanctions, one way or the other.
And isn't it interesting that except for early in the conflict, where the U.S. seized a couple of Iranian oil tankers, they haven't done any of that over the past year and a half. Now, part of that could be the fear, of what was going on had been going on in the Middle East and the Houthis and that. But something else to take really into consideration: the U.S. is very good at shooting themselves in the foot. Not quite shooting themselves in the head. We haven't gotten to that far yet, but definitely shooting themselves in the foot. Their own companies, as you mentioned, Schlumberger, Howard or Hughes Baker, and Halliburton are looking to expand into Russia, where the energy markets are, or where the energy development is. Then you have the U.S. pushing this Green New Deal, and Europe doing the same thing. We have the Biden administration cutting off coal production. You've got your own companies like ExxonMobil, which was one of the biggest in the world, not doing any development because oil leases were cut off. You have BNP, or not BNP, British Petroleum out of the UK. They decided to do their Green New Deal thing and no longer do the North Sea. So a lot of the West has just absolutely destroyed themselves without a thought beyond their, momentary emotional push to realize what the consequences are going to be. And, like with China, China's joining in with Russia on development of the Arctic. Well, the U.S. has been saying, oh, well, that's our backyard. We got to get into the Arctic. But they've done nothing. It's all rhetoric. They have no plans to do it because they can't think beyond a reactionary measure. And that's exactly what the U.S. has turned into, is everything is reactionary. Nothing is planned out. We want to do A, B, and C and come to this thing. The EV vehicle whole debacle, what is prime example of this. Let's just push through legislation that we have to get rid of all gas cars by 2030, 2035, and do these EVs, but we have no idea how we're going to build the infrastructure for it. We have no intention to build, what was it, uh, one of the infrastructure bill, $42 billion to put in Wi-Fi. They haven't done a single thing in 4 years. So the US is at the point that they cannot actually accomplish anything. Their companies are not interested or in doing that. It's almost like they get the money and then, it's boost up the stock. And you're seeing the entire nation, the industrial base, as well as the energy infrastructure, just eating itself from the inside with no brain to direct what's going on, head of the thing. And so they're suddenly relegated to having to beg hat in hand to anybody who does produce something just so they can survive day to day. And, we're going to talk about China, which is a big one here in another podcast. But the inevitability is this is a temporary respite for a problem that has no end solution of ever getting resolved.
No, and the bottom line is, if Russia wanted to cause mayhem in the West, all it needs to do is say, we're not shipping you any more energy ever again. Oil and gas to Europe, to the United Kingdom, to the United States. It's not happening. It's over. The West would collapse in the blink of an eye, particularly if they did it in January, February time when the energy storage facilities are low. And then they've got no way of replenishing them. And then next winter, the West, and I'm not saying they'll do this, but they have the potential to. And nobody at the political level is thinking about this. There are certainly people in Europe, the United States, the UK who are fully aware of the risks, who'll then say, if we push them too far, they could do this to us. In some ways, they're very lucky that Russia didn't do it, because by now we would have had probably 2 winters in the West, which would have been absolutely unbearable. There would have been no energy for heating. They would have to have rationing energy like you couldn't imagine. It would have made the problems Germany has economically seem like a proverbial drop in the ocean. So, again, that's one of those situations. Yes, it is all ideological. And to be honest, talking back about companies were forced to leave countries. They didn't want to leave. They had no desire to leave. And why would they want to? Because they were there for good reason. But they had no choice. Yet there's odd companies who have stayed and ignored it. But, circumstances can be such that it could be very, very difficult for companies to say or say no to the United States because they were fearful they could be sanctioned and wreck their business in the process, particularly European-based companies, but also companies in the US. So we shouldn't lose sight of the fact many companies didn't make the decision because they wanted to. They were forced into doing so. Another point worth making, which just highlights how ridiculous sanctions are. We haven't had figures through for 2024. We will do at some point next year. But if you go back to 2023, if you look at the 7 biggest European banks based on asset size, they paid about 900 million euros in taxes to the Russians. I mean, again, and they paid the bill. I mean, it wasn't like they didn't pay it. And probably, I don't know, I'm speculating here because there was all this idea we don't want paying in euros, we want paying in rubles. And I'm sure those facilities still exist to convert currency into rubles. I mean, that shows again a total disregard for sanctions. But again, the question people need to ask is, why would they do this? What operations are they continuing to conduct in Russia in the process, and why? And why is it so important for them to do that and pay 900 million euros or whatever it is in taxes, which of course goes towards Russia's economy, Russia's war effort, Russia's whatever. It's all part of the big melting pot of money that means Russia effectively, has managed its economy extremely well through this war. They don't have, don't have trade deficits. Their net debt is zero, and their actual debt is decreasing. And that's including the fact of all the assets that are frozen in the West in the process. But again, it just comes back to clever situations. And I'll use this as a final point from my perspective, which is clever ways of getting around sanctions as well, because there is the Druzhba oil pipeline. That's going to remain the main route of oil supplies from Russia to Hungary. I think this year there's about 4 million metric tons of oil has been supplied thus far over this pipeline. This was confirmed by the Hungarians themselves. Now, oil flown to Hungary over that pipeline is produced obviously in Russia. And I think early summer, the Ukrainians halted transit of, because it's Lukoil who's the major producer, having obviously added them to a sanctions list. Now, obviously, if you go to early autumn this year, the Hungarians actually found a way out of the problem. What they did is the company made agreements with oil shippers and pipeline operators, whereby it actually started purchasing oil on the Belarusian Ukraine border. So it bypassed the sanctions and they can still get the oil. And the irony, of course, is the pipeline transits Ukraine, and Ukraine's doing nothing to prevent this and saying, well, this really effectively is Russian oil, but where it's fortunately for Russia, there's a border between Belarus and Ukraine and Belarus and Russia, and they're bypassing it that way. And the irony is they bypass it with very clever ways but nobody does anything about it subsequently. They just ignore it and pretend it's not a problem. And we know Hungary's hardly flavor of the month with the United States or the European Union, but again, they're just going turn a blind eye because the risks are far greater in preventing Hungary having access to that energy, because that might create a tipping point in Hungary's mind with regards to potentially NATO membership, potentially their future in the European Union. And again, it's if one nation goes, the rot sets in very rapidly. So what this whole discussion's highlighted is not only the absurdity of sanctions, but the fact that sanctions themselves are pointless and they boomerang. Everyone can find ways around it. No one really has the stomach to implement them, not even the United States. It's just vacuous optics to create the impression the US was in control. But the US has been in control of absolutely nothing since the war started.
Very, very true. Anyway, I think that's a good place to end it here, Paul. I think we covered quite a bit. Thanks as always for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you very much for your support. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment. Helps the algorithm. Send this out to anybody you think it might be important. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.